close your eyes and let yourself drift back through time to the shadowed halls of faith, where candlelight flickers against cold stone, where whispered prayers mingle with secrets too heavy to bear. In the stillness of an empty cathedral, stone arches curve like the ribs of a sleeping giant. Candles tremble against the dark, and the air tastes faintly of incense and something older, something you cannot name. For centuries, the church has stood, not merely as a place of worship, but as a fortress of power. Its steeples reach toward the heavens, yet its roots burrow deep into the soil of human ambition. Beneath the hymns and the prayers, there are stories, stories written not in the gospel, but in whispers, stories that slip between the lines of history. Some are hidden in locked archives, others buried in unmarked graves. Tonight, we walk the long, candlelit corridors of that hidden history, and we do so slowly, not to rush toward answers, but to let the shadows speak. In the stillness of a cathedral at night, the air feels different. It is not simply silence, it is a kind of listening. The walls seem to lean in. The pillars stand like watchful sentinels. High above, the ribs of the vaulted ceiling curve together, like the bones of some ancient sleeping giant. The flicker of candlelight plays upon the stone, the light moving, like liquid gold. Each shadow it casts stretches and contracts, as though the cathedral itself is breathing. You take a slow step forward, and the sound echoes, then fades, swallowed by the enormity of the place. Your fingers graze the cold surface of a pew. The wood is worn, smoothed by the touch of countless hands across centuries. Some came here to pray, some to seek absolution, and others to plot, because the church was never merely a place of worship. It was a fortress, a throne room, a court, and sometimes a prison. When we speak of the church, we often think of a single holy body, one voice, one faith, but in truth, it is as vast and complex as the very world it spans. It is made of countless voices, and not all of them sing in harmony. For nearly 2,000 years, it has stood outlasting empires, surviving plagues, weathering wars, and yet, beneath the soaring steeples and ringing bells, there is another story, a story not found in the Gospels, not read aloud during Mass, but written in the margins of history and in the whispers of those who knew too much. Picture a dimly lit corridor, ancient stone, walls so thick the outside world barely exists within them. Along these halls, doors lead to chambers where decisions were made, decisions that shaped kingdoms and ended them. Somewhere in the dark, a scribe bends over parchment. Ink gleams wet under the candlelight. A seal is pressed into wax, and with that small gesture, a fate is sealed. Not all of these fates were acts of mercy. The Church's story is not one of unbroken holiness. It is also a story of power, and power is never pure. Where there is power, there will be ambition, and where ambition grows, secrets take root. Secrets, like weeds in a garden, they grow in the cracks, hidden from sight. But if you listen closely, in the stillness, you can almost hear them rustle. There are stories of popes who wielded armies, of bishops who brokered treaties and assassinations, of sacred relics sold to the highest bidder, of kings brought to their knees by a single excommunication. There are stories of miracles and of manipulation, of visions seen by saints and visions fabricated to serve a purpose. There are whispers of locked archives that hold letters no one must read, and darker whispers still of crimes hidden for generations beneath robes of authority. Tonight, we are not here to condemn, nor to defend. We are here to walk, slowly, through the shadowed halls of history. We will move from age to age, like candlelight wandering across stone. We will look into the corners, where the light does not reach. And as we go, you may feel the weight of the centuries pressing in, but do not hurry. Let the echoes speak, because every shadow comes from something real, and to see the truth of the Church's long life, you must be willing to walk in its darkness. Our journey will begin in the age when Rome was crumbling to dust, when the ancient empire's authority dissolved, and in the ruins rose a new kind of power, not bound by borders, not held by armies alone, but bound instead by faith. Faith that could crown emperors. Faith that could break them. We begin with thrones and mitres. There was a time when the Roman Empire was the heartbeat of the known world. Its roads stretched like arteries across continents. Its armies were the muscle that held the world in place. But no empire lasts forever. The marble began to crack. The borders began to fray, and in the 5th century, the great heart of Rome stopped. From the ruins came chaos. Cities burned. Merchants abandoned their trade routes. Once ordered provinces dissolved into smaller kingdoms, each fighting for survival. And in the middle of this disorder stood the Church. At first, it was not yet the towering institution we know today. It was a network, a web of bishops and priests, bound together by belief and by necessity. But where kings and generals fell, the Church endured. The bishops became not just shepherds of souls, but rulers of cities. They mediated disputes, they commanded militias, they managed resources like any earthly lord. Soon, a bishop's staff was as much a symbol of political authority as of spiritual guidance. And above all these bishops, there was one seat, the Bishop of Rome. The title would later be called Papa, Pope. It began humbly, but as the centuries turned, it became something far greater. The Pope was no mere cleric. He was a monarch without a single piece of land, yet with influence over all lands that recognized his authority. He could crown an emperor, or strip him of his crown. His blessing could make a war holy, and his condemnation could make even the mightiest ruler tremble. Picture the year, 800. It is Christmas Day. The great Basilica of St. Peter in Rome is filled with incense. The choir sings in Latin, their voices rising into the golden light streaming from high windows. At the center kneels a man, Charlemagne, king of the Franks, the most powerful ruler in Western Europe, and behind him stands Pope Leo III, in his hands a golden crown. The Pope places it upon Charlemagne's head, and with that act, Charlemagne becomes emperor. It is a moment thick with symbolism. The Pope, not the sword, has made the emperor. From then on, the message was clear. Earthly power was subject to heavenly authority, or at least to the man who claimed to speak for heaven. But such authority is never without challenge. Kings and popes clashed, each testing the other's strength. In the 11th century, this struggle reached its height. Imagine the snow-covered landscape of Canossa in the winter of 1077. A king, Henry IV of Germany, has been excommunicated by Pope Gregory VII, his authority stripped, his nobles turning against him. And so, Henry makes a long journey to the Pope's fortress in Italy. He arrives in the bitter cold. For 3 days, he stands barefoot in the snow outside the gates. Finally, Gregory allows him to enter. The Pope grants forgiveness, but the image remains of a king brought low before the church. And yet, the balance could tilt the other way. A century later, another pope, Boniface VIII, declared that kings must submit entirely to papal authority. But Philip IV of France did not kneel. Instead, he sent men to arrest the pope. Boniface died soon after, a reminder that even the highest mitre could fall to a crown. While these power struggles played out, another transformation was taking place. The church was becoming not just a political force, but a stage for earthly grandeur. Cathedrals rose higher and higher, their spires piercing the sky. Not just places to pray, but monuments to influence. The clergy wore robes of fine cloth. They sat at feasts with kings. They spoke in councils that decided the fate of nations. Some were devout. Others were politicians' investments. They traded favors for land. They promised protection in exchange for loyalty. And in time, many began to believe their authority was not only God-given, but unshakable. Yet, behind closed doors, the truth was more complicated. A bishop's palace might host secret negotiations. Bribes passed in purses heavy with gold coins, messages sent in cipher to allies in distant courts. There were even cases where papal elections were swayed by armed force, troops stationed outside, ready to encourage the cardinals toward the desired choice. And once elected, a pope could be both shepherd and schemer, a man who led prayers in the morning and ordered assassinations by nightfall. Still, to the common people, the church remained a beacon. The bells that called them to Mass were the heartbeat of their village. When plague struck, it was the priests who prayed over the dying. When famine came, it was the monasteries that shared their stores. And so, the paradox grew. The same institution that inspired deep devotion also engaged in ruthless politics. To many, this was simply the order of the world. To others, it was a sign that something holy was slowly being shadowed by ambition. And ambition needs more than influence to survive. It needs wealth, it needs resources to keep the gears of power turning. That pursuit would lead the church into another chapter, one paved with gold and guarded by silence. If the walls of the great cathedrals could speak, they would not always sing hymns. Some would speak in hushed tones of trials held in shadow, of footsteps echoing along cloistered corridors as a prisoner is led to judgment. And in that judgment, there was not always mercy. In the early centuries, the church fought heresy with debate, with councils, sermons, letters, but over time, debate gave way to tribunals. Truth could now be determined by the questioning of a few men behind closed doors. Men who claimed not only to know Scripture, but to hold the authority of God Himself. The Inquisition is a word that still chills the air when spoken. It began in the 12th century, first in southern France, to root out the Cathars, a sect that believed the material world was evil and that the church had strayed from its true calling. To the inquisitors, this was not a disagreement, it was a threat, And in an age where the Church's unity meant its survival, a threat could not be tolerated. The process was deliberate. An accusation could come from anyone, a neighbor, a rival, even a member of one's own family. Once accused, the suspect was summoned to appear. They were asked questions, some meant to clarify belief, others meant to unsettle, to test. If the answers were unsatisfactory, there might be more questioning. Long hours, repetition, pressure. And if still the suspect refused to recant, other methods were allowed. In a dim chamber, lit only by a single candle, a table might be set with unfamiliar instruments. The accused would be asked again to confess. Some confessed out of fear, others never did, and so punishment could range from the wearing of a penitent's robe to public humiliation to imprisonment or death. We must remember, not all inquisitors were cruel. Some truly believed they were saving souls from eternal damnation. But belief and cruelty are not strangers. One can grow from the other when the goal is seen as holy enough. And in the shadow of that belief, the Inquisition spread. It moved beyond France to Spain, Italy, the Low Countries. It was used to silence not just heresy, but dissent. Picture a small town in 15th century Spain. The bells toll unexpectedly. The townspeople gather in the square, whispers darting between them. A procession approaches. At its center, a man walks slowly, flanked by guards. His hands are bound, he wears a simple tunic, but around his neck hangs a placard bearing a charge: false doctrine. No one speaks to him. Some avert their eyes. Others watch, their faces unreadable. By nightfall, the town will sleep, and the man will not see another dawn. Such acts left scars, not only on individuals, but on entire communities. Trust could be broken in an instant. A word spoken in anger could end a life. And yet, the silence of the stones remained. The churches kept their grandeur. The bells rang for Mass, as though nothing had happened. The Inquisition was also a tool of information. Its records were meticulous. Every testimony, every confession, written down and stored. In some ways, it was an archive of fear, and those archives still exist. In them are the voices of thousands, captured on parchment. Some repentant, some defiant. All silent now. Centuries later, when we walk through the same churches, the stone feels cold beneath our fingers. It is beautiful, but heavy, because the beauty was not only the work of the faithful, but also the work of control. Control to keep the church united. Control to guard its authority. And in guarding it, innocent lives were taken. Faith became intertwined with fear. But power and fear alone cannot sustain such a vast institution. It needed more. It needed resources. And in the centuries ahead, it would gather them, not only in the form of influence, but in glittering, tangible wealth. Gold. It is a strange thing, how the human heart responds to its glow. It is not simply beauty, it is power made visible, a metal that does not rust, that survives the centuries untouched, as if even time itself respects it. From the earliest days, the faithful brought offerings to their churches. At first, they were simple things: olive oil for the lamps, wool for the poor, bread for the altar. But as the centuries turned and the church's influence grew, so too did its gifts. Kings sent golden chalices, their bowls hammered thin, then engraved with scenes from Scripture. Merchants offered jeweled reliquaries studded with garnet, sapphire, and pearl. Even the poorest peasant might drop a single coin into the collection box, a coin that could mean a day's bread for his family. It was given freely, with love, with devotion, and yet wealth has a way of multiplying and of changing those who guard it. The Vatican's vaults swelled. Monasteries owned not just chapels, but vast tracts of farmland, vineyards, fishing rights, even mills and markets. The Church became one of the largest landowners in Europe, and with land came revenue. In the great basilicas, altars gleamed. Mass was celebrated beneath ceilings painted with scenes of heaven itself. Light poured through stained glass, casting colors across the marble floor. It was breathtaking, a taste of paradise on earth. But this paradise had a price. To raise money for crusades, for cathedral building, for papal courts, the Church began to offer something unique. It was called an indulgence. The idea was that the Church could lessen the punishment a soul would face after death. Not erase sin entirely, but shorten the time in purgatory. At first, indulgences were granted for acts of genuine devotion, praying a certain number of hours, making a pilgrimage, donating to the poor. But over time, a simpler method emerged: money, a payment to the Church, in exchange for spiritual benefit. It was a system that drew rivers of gold into the treasury. Coins clinked in strong boxes, ledgers filled with neat lines of ink, each marking a soul's hope for mercy. And for those who administered it, the temptation grew. Indulgences were not only a means of charity, but a means of funding armies, of financing lavish courts, of expanding influence. In some cases, the poor gave more than they could afford, believing they were buying not only their own peace, but that of loved ones long dead. Then there were the relics, fragments of bone said to belong to saints, splinters of wood claimed to be from the true cross, pieces of cloth said to have touched the robe of Christ. Pilgrims traveled for weeks, even months, to see them. They brought offerings, coins, jewelry, livestock. Some relics were genuine, many were not, but the demand was immense. In some churches, you could see dozens of these holy objects. Enough nails, they said, to crucify 100 Christs, and always the offerings poured in. The wealth was not hidden, it was displayed. On altars, in processions, in the rings and robes of high-ranking clergy, gold-threaded vestments, mitres encrusted with jewels, croziers, bishops' staffs, carved from ivory, tipped with gilded filigree. To many, this was a sign of God's blessing. To others, it was a sign of something else. The gap between the Church's grandeur and the poverty of its flock was hard to ignore. In the markets, stories began to spread of bishops who dined on silver plates while beggars shivered outside their gates, of abbots whose cellars were filled with rare wine, even as famine gnawed at the countryside. And still, the offerings came. Because for the faithful, giving to the Church was giving to God, even if the path their gold took was not always clear. In Rome, the Vatican became both a spiritual capital and a court of earthly splendor. Ambassadors from distant kingdoms waited in its halls for audiences with the Pope. Artists competed for commissions to paint the next chapel ceiling, to carve the next marble saint. The Church was not only a keeper of souls, but a patron of the arts, a financier, a landowner, a political broker. Its influence reached into every part of life. And yet, wealth has its dangers. It can shield wrongdoing. It can tempt even the devout. It can create a silence when questions should be asked. Some began to wonder whether the church's golden treasury was truly filled for the glory of God or for the security of men. But the gold did not only buy beauty, it also bought secrecy. It funded messengers who carried letters no one was meant to read. It paid guards to watch doors that were never opened to the public. It maintained archives, where the most sensitive documents could be kept out of sight. These archives would grow into one of the most mysterious collections in the world, and to reach them, you would have to pass through doors that most will never see. Somewhere, in the heart of Vatican City, beyond the basilicas, beyond the courtyards, beyond the guarded gates, there is a door. It is plain, unremarkable, but it does not open to the public. Behind it lies a place known as the Archivum Apostolicum Vaticanum, the Vatican Apostolic Archive. The name was once the Secret Archive, not because its contents were sinister, at least not officially, but because the word secretum in Latin meant private, belonging to the Pope. And yet, that word feels heavier in the imagination. Private, hidden, sealed. The archives stretch far beneath the ground, row upon row of shelves lined with manuscripts, bound volumes, scrolls, letters sealed with wax hundreds of years old. It is said the shelves, if placed end to end, would stretch for more than 80 kilometers. And they are still growing. Most of what they hold are not secrets at all. There are papal bulls, decrees, records of correspondence with kings, maps of vanished kingdoms. But among these are items that stir the imagination. A letter from Michelangelo, complaining about payment for his work on the Sistine Chapel. A document excommunicating Martin Luther. The trial records of Galileo. Each is a fragment of history that shaped the world. And then, there are the rumors. Some say the archives hold texts that contradict official church teaching. Accounts of Jesus' life not found in the Gospels, written by early followers. Others whisper about letters proving political manipulation, alliances with emperors and warlords, agreements that shifted the tides of history without the knowledge of the people. There are even tales of documents about prophecies, of instructions for rituals now forbidden, of evidence of miracles, or of frauds. Very few are allowed inside. Scholars may request access, but only to specific documents, and only under strict supervision. No wandering the aisles. No leafing through the past at leisure. It is said that there are rooms where even the archivists rarely go. Locked chambers, keys in the possession of only a handful of men. Imagine walking those halls. The air is cool, dry, carefully controlled to protect the fragile paper. The scent is of old parchment, beeswax, and dust. Light falls in narrow beams, illuminating motes that drift lazily in the stillness. Your footsteps sound far too loud here. Every turn of a page feels like it disturbs something that has been sleeping for centuries. Perhaps you stop before a shelf. A leather-bound volume rests there, its spine cracked with age. You slide it free, feeling the weight of the centuries in your hands. You open it. The ink is brown now, but the words are still clear. It is a letter, written in a hand you do not recognize, to a pope long dead. It speaks of a meeting between the church and a ruler whose name still echoes in history. It speaks of a bargain, a trade, not of goods, but of promises. The final lines are written in a hurried script. They hint at something unspoken, something agreed to in person, never to be recorded. You close the book, and for a moment, you feel as though you have glimpsed the hidden machinery of the world. But in truth, most of us will never set foot here. We will never know exactly what is kept in the sealed rooms, or what lies in the boxes marked simply with a date, or with a name long forgotten. Perhaps the most unsettling thought is not what the archives hold, but what might have been destroyed. History is written by those who keep the records, and history can also be erased by those same hands. In a place like this, truth is not simply preserved. It is curated, shaped, and in that shaping, power is maintained. Because power is not only in armies or in gold, it is in knowledge. The one who knows can decide who else may know, and who will never know. From the locked doors of the archives, our path now turns to another kind of locked door, not of wood, but of silence, the silence that falls when scandal threatens to be heard. When the Church has faced not just political intrigue, not just questions of doctrine, but human frailty, hidden behind holy walls, that silence would one day shatter. Scandal is not a new visitor to the Church. It has come in many forms: whispers in the marketplace, rumors in the courts of kings, and sometimes loud accusations shouted in the streets. The Church, with all its wealth, its hierarchy, its human leadership, has always walked a narrow road between spiritual service and worldly temptation. From the earliest centuries there were murmurs. Bishops accused of hoarding wealth, monks who broke their vows, abbots who lived in comfort while their followers starved. Sometimes the scandals were political: alliances with violent rulers, blessings given to wars that would spill oceans of blood. Sometimes they were far more personal. During the Renaissance, the papal court itself became infamous for excess and corruption. The selling of indulgences, promises of reduced time in purgatory in exchange for coin, became so common, so brazen, that it would ignite the spark of the Protestant Reformation. Behind the grandeur of the cathedrals, there were cardinals who lived like princes, banquets that lasted for days, and gold flowing in from every corner of Christendom. It is in times like these that the lines between devotion and greed grow thin, and eventually blur. But not all scandals are about money. Some are about silence. Silence can protect holiness. Silence can preserve mystery. But silence can also hide what must not be hidden. In the late 20th century, the Church would face a crisis that no locked archive, no centuries of tradition could contain. Accusations began to surface against priests. They were not about doctrine. They were not about politics. They were about harm, about betrayal, about trust broken in the most intimate and sacred of settings. At first, the accusations seemed isolated. A priest here, a parish there. A tragedy in one community, quietly handled, moved away from public eyes. But over time, a pattern emerged. Reports from different countries, different languages, different decades, told the same story. Abuse had occurred. Victims had spoken. And instead of justice, many found silence. The silence was not always cruel in intent. Sometimes it came from a desire to protect the Church from scandal. Sometimes from a belief that repentance and reassignment would be enough. But for those who had been harmed, the silence was its own wound. Journalists began to investigate. Documents once hidden in diocesan files were brought into the light. Court cases were opened, and what emerged shook the faith of millions. It was not just the crimes themselves, it was the cover-up, the movement of accused priests from one parish to another without warning the communities, the failure to act decisively to protect the innocent. In Boston, in Ireland, in Australia, in so many places, the same revelations surfaced. The Church, which had so often stood as a moral guide, was now being accused of protecting the guilty at the expense of the vulnerable. For some believers, the pain was unbearable. Their trust, not just in the clergy but in the institution itself, was fractured. For others, the scandals became a call to reform, to greater transparency, to an end of the culture of silence. In the years that followed, popes would speak publicly about these crimes. They would meet with survivors. They would promise change. Policies were created. Training and safeguards were implemented. Some bishops were removed. Some were held to account. And yet, the shadow remains, because memory lingers. And for many, the wound does not heal quickly. When an institution so ancient, so deeply woven into human history, is stained by such acts, the questions cut deep. How much can be blamed on individuals, and how much on the structures that allowed it to continue? What does forgiveness mean when trust has been broken on such a scale? And perhaps the most unsettling question of all: how many more stories remain untold? Scandal does not destroy faith for everyone. For some, it refines it. It strips away the illusion of perfection, leaving something raw and perhaps more honest. For others, the scandal is the end of the road, a door closing, never to be reopened. The Church is not the only place where such betrayals have occurred. But when they happen here, within walls meant to be a refuge, they carry a particular weight. It is the paradox of sacred power, that the higher the trust, the deeper the wound when that trust is broken. And so, the shadow of scandal remains woven into the tapestry of church history. It is a thread that cannot be removed without unraveling the whole. But perhaps it can serve as a reminder that the light and the dark have always existed together, even in the holiest of places. From here, our path leads not to the courts nor to the archives, but to the realm of belief itself, to the stories of miracles, visions, and prophecies, and the fine line between faith and deception. Thank you for joining us tonight as we uncovered the dark side of the Church, power, corruption, and its deep secrets. Until the next midnight tale, sleep well and dream deep.